Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening on the eve of a historic inauguration. My name is Dawn DePrince, and I am the Chief Operating Officer for History Colorado. Before we start this evening, we would like to acknowledge, in the spirit of healing and education, the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are our partners. We consult with them when we plan exhibits, collect, preserve, and interpret artifacts, do archaeological work, and create educational programs. We recognize these Indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of this land. This past year has certainly been tumultuous. In these times, understanding history has felt especially urgent. History gives us context. How have we gotten to this moment? History gives us hope. How have we survived and endured such tragedy before? History strengthens our resilience. What have humans done before to overcome inequities, division, and injustice? History gives us role models and blueprints for enacting change and improving the world. For example, what can I learn from Martin Luther King or Jonas Salk, the civil rights movement, or the suffrage movement that could make a difference today? And in a postmodern culture, seemingly eager to embrace alternative facts and post-truth paradigms, history organizations like History Colorado have an obligation to practice evidence-based truth-seeking and storytelling that illuminates a plurality of perspectives, experiences, and events. The president of the American Association of State and Local History beautifully stated this, quote, "As historical institution and history practitioners, it is our duty to oppose distortions of facts and misuses of the historical record, and to oppose racist and anti-democratic efforts to demean, divide, and subjugate." This is the spirit of tonight's event, and it is the fabric of who History Colorado is and the work we do throughout the state. Now more than ever, we could use your support and contributions as members or donors as we collectively navigate this complicated world amid a prolonged pandemic and related economic crisis, which has caused a reduction in History Colorado's main funding source of more than 50%. Your donations support our mission to bring programs like these to you. Please consider a gift today through our website, historycolorado.org, and we will share the direct link in our chat tonight. We are deeply grateful for your support and your participation in these challenging times. Thank you. We also invite you to join a discussion this Thursday night that kicks off our new season of Borderlands Lectures. Historian Derek Everett is delivering a presentation called Carving Up a Continent at 6 p.m. He'll explore how state boundaries emerged and what impact they still have, from our own beloved San Luis Valley to the Pacific Coast into the Mississippi Valley. You can, we'll have a link in the chat for you to sign up, or you can visit historycolorado.org/events. And now I'm delighted to turn this over to my colleague, Jason Hansen, who is History Colorado's Chief Creative Officer. He will introduce us to Colorado's incredible State Historians Council and facilitate their illuminating conversation. Thank you.
Hello and good evening, everyone. You don't need me to tell you that we live in uncertain times, and it's never really been more apparent. But I'll tell you anyway, just briefly. At History Colorado, we've been publishing a series of essays this month that we're calling the Hindsight 2020 Project, in which we've asked some of the smartest people we know to reflect on how they think the year 2020 will go down in history. And it's been a really enjoyable project. You can find it at our website if you'd like to check it out. If there's one consensus emerging from the essays so far, it's that historians a century from now are going to have an awful lot of material when they look back to this period that we're all just calling our daily lives. And if you're anything like me, the way one unprecedented or historical moment is just stacking up on top of another these past years or weeks or even days, it leaves you feeling a little bit dizzy sometimes, a little bit unsettled, not really sure what to make of it all. One thing I do know is that we can lean on our history in these unsettled moments in the ways it can teach us, and ground us, and strengthen us, and even comfort us with perspectives that reach beyond our own current experiences. At its best, our shared history can help illuminate a path to a brighter shared future. And that is, at its essence, what we're here to do tonight, to reflect on our shared history in ways that bring perspective to this moment in time, perspective that will help us chart our path forward from here. Today, I saw a tweet urging President-elect Biden to appoint a National Historians Council. And that's pretty good advice, if you ask me. And if President Biden does it, I know 5 people who I would recommend for the job. Colorado is incredibly lucky to already have our very own State Historians Council. The council reaches across the state and aids in our interpretation of history about Colorado and the West. It helps us expand our understanding of historical perspectives, cultures, and places in Colorado. And it produces new scholarship about our state that helps us make sense of how we got to now. And if it's okay with you, I would like to introduce our council members right now. And I would ask our council members to turn on your camera when I introduce you. We'll start with Dr. Nikki Gonzalez is a professor of history at Regis University, whose research includes the American Southwest and the Chicano movement in Colorado. And Nikki has helped History Colorado on numerous exhibits over the years. Please welcome Nikki. Nikki, you can turn on your camera. Dr. Tom Noel, who many of you know as Dr. Colorado, is a professor emeritus of history at the University of Colorado, Denver, who has written more than 50 books and countless articles about Colorado and the West. Dr. Jared Orsi is a professor of history at Colorado State University in Fort Collins and the director of the Public Lands History Center, whose work specializes in environmental and borderlands history, and whose book on Zebulon Pike was recently a finalist for the Colorado Book Award. Dr. Dwayne Vandenbush is a professor of history at Western Colorado University, where he has taught the history of the US West, especially water, public lands, and the environment, since 1962, and whose book on the Western Slope has been the standard text on the region since it was published in 1981. He is this year the chair of the State Historians Council and the Colorado State Historian. And Dr. William Way is a professor of history at the University of Colorado at Boulder, where his research focuses on modern China and Asian American history. And he is also the editor-in-chief of the Colorado Encyclopedia. So he literally brings an encyclopedic knowledge of Colorado to his role on the council. His forthcoming book will focus on our History Colorado exhibition, Zoom In, the history of the Centennial State in 100 objects, illuminating that shared history I spoke of through 100 of our most treasured artifacts. We are incredibly lucky, and I count myself to be among the luckiest to get to work with such learned and distinguished scholars as these. We're gonna start, but before we do, just a little bit about how tonight will go. This is a conversation that we are all lucky enough to eavesdrop on tonight. It's not a series of conference presentations or individual statements. And that means it's not necessarily about answers, but it is about dialogue and perspective. I imagine the conversation is going to cover much of what is on all of our minds right now. But if you do have a question, please feel free to share it through the chat feature. And one of my teammates at History Colorado will monitor the chat and share the questions with me. And I promise I will do my best to guide our conversation toward all of these questions over the course of the evening. And so with that, I would like to start our conversation by asking our council members, as we look back over recent events, including the continuing aftershocks of the pandemic, calls for racial justice, heightened economic insecurity, bitter partisan politics, and the insurrection at the US Capitol, just to name a few. Is there a moment in our past that you would point to as instructive or helpful for gaining useful perspective on the events of the present? I think I will start off by asking Dr. Colorado Tom Noel to begin us.
You're on mute. Tom, you're on mute.
Yeah, there. Thank you, William. And thank you, Jason. It's great to be here with such an illustrious group of folks. But I want to remind people that the destruction of the Capitol last week was not the first time that has happened. Way back in 1814, during the war in 1812, British troops attacked the Capitol, destroyed the Capitol building, also burned down the White House and destroyed a bunch of other buildings, federal buildings in the Capitol. Fortunately, God was on the side of the rebels. It rained very hard the next day and put out all those fires. The British claimed they were doing this in retaliation for the American attack on York, now known as Toronto, where, as Jared Dorsey could tell you, Zebulon Pike met his death. But it is interesting to know that this has happened before. That time the Capitol was nearly completely destroyed, but rebuilt by Latrobe, the original architect.
Fascinating, Dwayne. What other periods might we all be looking to, all of us students of history out here in Zoom land?
Yes, I can go. There's so much to choose from, first of all. I think that this is like the historian's moment. I mean, there's so many comparisons. Everybody, all your friends are asking you, so what does this remind you of? How do we get out of it? So I think the image that is seared into my mind is the image of the Confederate flag in the US Capitol. And so that takes my mind directly to the Civil War, and especially the 12 years following the Civil War, when we engaged in this process of reconstructing the nation. And I'm drawing these links, and I still haven't figured this out yet, but I'm drawing these links between, like, where do we get this angry mob of insurrectionists? And I think it goes back to that era of Reconstruction where we have these unresolved issues of race. We had just fought a civil war. Part of the plan was to kind of work out what to do with 4 million emancipated former enslaved people, how to kind of incorporate them into the American fabric. What does it mean to have them be fully American? What rights does that carry? And then at the end of that 12 years, we have in 1877 a compromise, which basically puts a Northern Republican in the presidency and then leaves the South to Southern Democrats. And federal government pulls out of the South, and those questions of race remain unresolved. And I think, there's an argument to be made that they're still unresolved today. So that's what comes to my mind.
Well, for me, the last 4 years reminds me of the McCarthy era in American history, which I know all of you know as one of the most tumultuous and arguably darkest periods in our history. A period when Senator Joe McCarthy, engaged in a personal reign of terror in which he basically engaged in intimidation, demagoguery, and created for himself a cult of personality. And trust me, as a historian of modern China, I know something about cults of personality. And I certainly think that McCarthy, was such a figure, and the man he was really quite terrible. I'm being polite when I say terrible. He ruined the lives of many people by accusing them falsely of being a communist or communist sympathizers. In fact, he argued on his way to power that he knew of all of these subversives in our government and in our society, and he was going to launch a crusade to ferret them out and presumably to save the nation. And I see some of that resonating today, seeing parallels with the last 4 years of our history.
Well, I would throw out 1932 and the bonus army march on Washington, D.C. as a moment that I find ripe with contrasts and comparisons to events of the last year. It's a little known event in American history, but it had a outsized causal impact on 20th century American society and politics. So it's spring of 1932. We're in the depths of the Great Depression. People are hungry. They can't feed and clothe their kids. They're out of work. They're losing their farms to banks. They're worried that their landlords are going to evict them. Not unlike 2020 for a lot of people in America. And veterans, World War I veterans, start streaming from across the country and heading for Washington, D.C. And the more that they hear of others doing it, the more of them do it. And eventually, more than 17,000 of them descend on Washington, D.C. And if you count their families and sympathizers, it's more than 40,000 people coming to Washington, D.C. And the reason they're coming there is because in 1924, Congress had passed a law promising a bonus to the veterans for their service and sacrifice for the nation in World War I. And they started thinking in the Great Depression that they really needed that bonus now. The bonus was supposed to be paid in the 1940s. And they realized, they thought, we need this now. We can't wait to be paid until the 1940s. So they occupy buildings in Washington, D.C. They occupy public open spaces, parks, camp along the river bottoms in and around the city. And they lobby Congress to pay the promised bonus early. They march. They lobby their congressional representatives. They get the House to pass a bill promising to pay the bonus early. The Senate, however, rejects the bill and adjourns. And everybody thinks the bonus army is going to go home, but they don't. They say they're going to stay until their bonus is paid, even if it lasts until they have to wait till 1945. And President Hoover, it's an election year, President Hoover orders that the Capitol be cleared of the marchers. And the Army commander, a fellow named General Douglas MacArthur, led the bonus marchers out of Washington, D.C. at bayonet point with tanks behind the troops and set their camps on fire, burning their belongings, chasing the families away. Now, I think this raises, and of course, then this becomes one of the catalysts for Franklin Roosevelt to defeat Hoover in a landslide election the following November. I think it raises a couple of interesting points for us to think about today, though. One is that the the bonus marchers came to Washington because they believed in America and they believed in American institutions. They came to ask the government to do something for them, and they believed the government would do it. I think it's worth distinguishing those who come to Washington believing in American institutions from those who come to prevent American institutions from working and causing them to grind to a halt. The other thing that I think the bonus march raises for us is the possibility of cross-racial cooperation. It's worth noting that the bonus army was surprisingly integrated for its time. And there's a few moments in American history, I think, that hold promise for genuine cross-racial cooperation, moments when the commonality of interests across race become so obvious and so strong that they threaten to break down the barriers that otherwise divide us as Americans. And generally, America has not taken those opportunities. So for example, Franklin Roosevelt, although there was some civil rights progress made during his administration, he actively opposed many issues that were particularly important for African Americans, such as the passage of a federal anti-lynching law. But I believe that we live in one of those moments of potential cross-racial cooperation today. And I think that if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris would like to move beyond FDR, they might seize the moment and lead cooperation across racial boundaries in America.
You know, when I think about what happened a couple of weeks ago on Wednesday, I'm reminded of what Tom mentioned, the War of 1812, when a foreign enemy hit Washington, D.C., but also reminded of when Robert E. Lee approached it a couple of times during the Civil War, and it was in doubt of whether or not we could hang on to the Capitol. And then also when Puerto Rican nationalists attacked the government in 1954. Those are three things I think that kind of bring us up to what happened a couple of weeks ago. I have decided that I talk a little bit about the 1920s and bring that in perspective, what was going on today. You know, at that time, during World War I, there wasn't much of freedom of the press or freedom of speech. Very famous court case of Schenck versus the US, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, clear and present danger. You could restrict speech, you could restrict the males, you could restrict things because it was a clear and present danger. Women finally got some rights in 1920, the right to vote. Blacks were in terrible condition in the 1920s, the first to be fired and the last to be hired, they said. A. Mitchell Palmer was Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, and he conducted a series of illegal raids against socialists, communists, anarchists, anybody really opposed the government. And a lot of that was pretty much illegal. During the 1920s, prohibition was on. People violated the law, Murder Incorporated was created. But the big thing that I would like to mention was a movie came out in 1915 with Cecil B. DeMille directing and Lillian Gish as one of the great actresses. And it was called Birth of a Nation. And it really was a testimonial on behalf of the Ku Klux Klan, which had started in 1867, but which now kind of revived as a result of that movie in 1915. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan had 3 to 6 million members, 11 governors, 16 senators, and 75 members in the House. The mayor of Denver, member of the Klan. The governor of Colorado, member of the Klan. Many of the members of the General Assembly in Colorado, a member of the Klan. And one of the misconceptions of the Klan, it was a Southern organization, when in fact it was a nationwide organization. And there were a lot more people in the Klan in Indiana or in California than in any Southern state. So tremendous nativism during the 1920s. If you weren't a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you were considered beneath anybody else. And the politicians of the time, and many of them said this, and I'm quoting, believed in 100% Americanism. I'm going to quote Susan B. Anthony, who talked in 1875 in Lake City in 2 talks. She said it was we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. Contrast that with Governor Clifford Walker of Georgia in 1924, talking to a Ku Klux Klan rally. I would build a wall of steel, a wall as high as heaven, against the admission of a single one of those Southern Europeans who never thought the thoughts or spoke the language of a democracy in their lives. And then there was Emma Lazarus, 1883, with a poem that went on the Statue of Liberty in 1903. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest tossed, to me. I live my lamp beside the golden door. That's the contrast. And the United States has been in a lot worse situations historically than we are in now. This thing is going to be a blimp on the radar scale compared to the Civil War and a lot of other things that we went through in this country.
Well, I think Dwayne has just thrown down a gauntlet there, folks. What do you think of that? A blip?
Well, let me first of all say that I think we will survive the moment. I think that the nation will endure. I think the American project will go on. But the effects that we are experiencing, and let me simply speak to the current, a phenomenon of Trumpism as opposed to McCarthyism, will linger. Just as McCarthyism has lingered, I think Trumpism will linger and constitute a threat. Arguably, some of the things, Dwayne, that you've been mentioning is an example of that. For example, the Ku Klux Klan that you've been describing to us so well, we are talking about what they represent, right? White supremacy. Well, we've seen a lot of evidence of that in the last 4 years. And McCarthyism, certainly in its own fashion, gave rise to it, by raising the issue of Americanism and who should be an American, right? And in the minds of a lot of the people who supported him, that was to the exclusion of people of color. And it also gave birth to what we think of as the modern conservative movement. So this continued to the present. And that's the problem. We will survive. But can we in fact learn from what has transpired recently? And try to mitigate the impact of it for future generations.
So I'd like to comment on the blip as well. My hope is that future historians will look back on this period as a moment when Americans confronted the darkness in their soul and rose to the occasion and overcame it. Martin Luther King, in letter to from the Birmingham jail in 1963, said that time is neutral, and time, whether things go away with time or whether they get better with time or worse, has to do with what you do when confronted with challenges. And so I'd like to think that America can take up King's challenge there and do the right thing, and maybe the darkness of today will be a blip, but we will remember the time for many people standing up and doing the right thing.
I think I'll comment on that too. Jared, I love your optimism, and Dwayne, I love your optimism too. I tend to be a little bit darker, I guess. I see this, and I'm still trying to figure this out myself, but I see this current era is, we're flirting with fascism. And I tend to think that, what we see today, this deep, deep division and this deep inequality, this out of control inequality that we have, the environmental situation that we're in, it's been brewing for 50 years. And I would even push it back farther. So where I thought you were going with that, Jared, was the issue of time and how maybe it's not productive to think about it in like pieces of American history, but this is one continuous narrative that we're trying to figure out. And we're addressing the same questions that we tried to address 150 years ago, and we still haven't figured it out. And as long as we still don't confront those tough subjects and get distracted or just give up on them, this racial inequality, economic inequality, and so forth, we're gonna keep seeing this happen over and over. And I'm really intrigued also, Jared, by what you said about the potential for cross-racial alliances, because I see some of that, but I also see kind of a counter movement where there's these deep forces that are trying to divide, right? And we've seen that before, like we always see that. And so I don't know where we're headed. I don't know if this will be, I think it'll be more than a blip, but I don't really know. So those are just some thoughts that I've had.
Nikki, in terms of,
speaking of divisions, Nikki, I think it's interesting parallels between Biden and President Abraham Lincoln. Both tried to bridge that gap to end the division. Lincoln was elected. There were threats he was going to be assassinated. He actually gave his inaugural address first in Springfield, thinking he might not live to give it in Washington, D.C. And then that speech is where he talks about the better angels of our nature. And he actually reaches out to the South and says, we're not enemies, we're friends, and tries to do everything he can to reconcile the departing South. And I think President Biden has somewhat wisely taken the same approach towards his enemies and critics.
And look at the results. Besides his assassination, right? Did the nation, in fact, unify? The Reconstruction or the post-Reconstruction period would suggest that didn't work out so well. We continued to perpetuate slavery in the form of segregation, and we had to wait, many years before we could effectively address some of those issues, and we still haven't, solved them. So it's a problem. It's a problem.
You say blip on the radar scale, probably too general, but I'm also referring to the coronavirus, along with the 4 years of President Trump's administration. I think any fair-minded person, whether he or she be a Democrat or Republican, would say that his 4 years have been pretty much out of the ordinary in terms of the way presidents have operated before. But it's 4 years in American history. And tomorrow at noon, he'll be gone. And President Biden will be in, and hopefully at that point, we will reestablish ourselves with the world and believe in science and make some of the changes that we need to make to start solving some of the problems that Nikki has talked about, that are problems that have gone on for hundreds of years. When you talk about Black people and slavery, I mean, we've made great progress in the last 50 or 60 years. We got a long ways to go. But obviously, this isn't something that's going to be solved in the next 5 years or 10 years. It's a work in progress.
So Dwayne, I think one of the unusual things that you're pointing to might be the way that new forms of media, social media, and particularly channels like Twitter have played an increasing role in our lives over the last 4 years, but really over the last decade. I'm curious how you all see the peril, but also the promise of how new media is contributing to the divisions we have and maybe the solutions that we might
I'm going to show you a book that I've been reading by John Meacham. It's called The Soul of America. And in his conclusion, one of the things he says that we need to do is to resist tribalism. Be flexible, hear out others. Don't let cable network or Twitter feed tell you what to think. I think part of the problem that we have today, maybe the major problem, is that, you know, when I grew up, we didn't have social media. We didn't have Twitter, tweeting, Snapchat, or whatever they call it. You know, you listen to the radio and everything wasn't instantaneous. You know, in World War II, you know, it'd be 3 weeks before you found out about a battle. And that gave us time enough to have a little perspective and think about it. Now everything is so immediate and so passionate on social media that I think we've got a terrific problem.
Other opinions on social media?
Well,
I'm,
I'll,
I'm for
I
the
want to go back to Tom and Nikki's point about long underlying tendencies in American history, and that social media can amplify those. It can, you know, ameliorate those. But there's a lot in America that is consistent through social media. So to Tom's point about the better angels of our nature, which is, you know, just a beautiful piece of American rhetoric, and an appeal by Lincoln to persuade Americans to forgive, to put aside their differences, but it's also a speech in which he promised not to tamper with slavery. And so I think that in that one speech, there's the best and worst of America is embedded in that speech. And Nikki raised the point about we're still working through the same racial problems that we have been for years and years. And I want to go back to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which I read every year on Martin Luther King's holiday. I read it sometimes in between with my classes, but I always make a point of reading it on the holiday. I was reading it last night, and in the book that I have it in has some photographs from the era, and I was looking at them, and there's a photograph of a Birmingham policeman kneeling on the neck of a well-dressed woman who had been marching in Birmingham. And this year, I couldn't help but see George Floyd in that picture. So social media gives us new windows, new perspectives, new ways to express ourselves, but there's an awful lot about America that is deep-seated and deep-rooted in our past and present and likely our future.
Look, I'm a great supporter of the First Amendment and our right to speak and to assemble. And but one of the things I do worry about are people, leaders in particular, who take advantage of it. And these days, as you point out, Dwayne, you know, they can do it with great speed by using social media to, in effect, manipulate, if you will, manipulate the population. Look, I think we have great journalists. I'm a great believer in a free press, you know, but sometimes over the 4 years, I've been watching them being, if you will, complicit in the promotion of lies, because they believe that what they should be doing is reporting what's being said. And what was being reported were lies. And it took them many years to get around to challenging those lies, to calling them out. It got to the point now where some of the social media platforms, like Twitter, have decided, well, enough is enough. We're no longer going to be a vehicle for, you know, the promotion of lies. And those lies, the big lie, most recently, of course, being a stolen election, is what stirred the mob to attack the US Capitol. Yeah. So I feel very, in some ways, torn. Yeah. But it's very much like hate speech. I don't think anyone has a right, you know, to say something that would endanger others. So there has to be a line there. And what I worry about is the speed, the point you were making, the speed with which they can do it. You can galvanize a crowd very quickly and bring them together very quickly. And that indeed constitutes a threat to the republic.
You know, here's what Harry Truman said about that in a couple of lines. I just jotted it down from Soul of America. He said, "I am told if you tell a lie often enough, people will believe it." Yeah. Harry Truman said, "If you tell the truth often enough, they will believe it and go along with you."
Yeah, what that makes me think of is that I think and this is an overarching problem, and I think a bigger problem that we're going to have to confront as a society, which is we're in a post-truth kind of era right now. And William, you brought up the big lie, right? There are big lies, about the election, and then there's smaller lies, like my inauguration was the most well attended in the history of humanity. These lies, and then they get perpetuated on social media. And I mean, these are almost like philosophical questions that we have to grapple with. How do we bring back at least the pursuit of truth, or how do we check our sources? As historians, we cite our sources, to an exhaustive degree, but it's like anything goes. It's like, the Wild West. So.
Well, one of the things I do in class is that I try to teach my students critical thinking skills. Mm-hmm. And I teach them to, I teach them that they need evidence. They need evidence to support their arguments. And one of the things that I'm unable to do is persuade them, to teach them how to deal with people who don't reason, who don't care about evidence, who are basically moving forward based on emotion, on grievances, real or imagined. And I'm thinking, man, this is a tough situation. What do you do about people who, as far as they're concerned, no matter what you say, no matter how much evidence you provide, it's just an opinion. As far as they're concerned, that's an opinion, and their opinion is as good as your opinion.
So one thing this brings up, and it's something that I'm seeing in various forms in questions from the audience, is where do we go from here? Are there examples we can look to where power? There's a phrase, power is not given, it's taken. Are there moments we can look to where there was actually some recognition that power needed to be shared? Are there moments we can look to where fundamental concepts of humanity have come under stress? This idea of truth, for instance, or fact, and we've been able to collectively reestablish a common understanding or faith in the institutions that help safeguard these things for us. What are your thoughts as we're getting surprisingly close to the hour here? I'd love to pivot and just ask you, what are your thoughts about what history tells us about where we could go from here?
Jason, one of the questions that you put on email was, how will we restore trust in institutions that have failed us? And I would like to throw this out. I don't think our institutions have failed us. I think that we as a people maybe have failed ourselves. And I'll give an example of what I'm talking about. To regain trust, we've got to be honest. We've got to trust science. We've got to be tolerant of other views. When I was at Oklahoma State, I was in a seminar, and Dr. David Donald of Harvard talked to the seminar, and he made a comment I've never forgotten. He said, "The American people tend to get the leaders they deserve." When the American people are informed, when the American people have good intentions, they're going to get good leaders. When they begin to slide, they won't. And I just like to throw that out.
I think we need, I think Biden and Harris need to figure out what the 21st century social media equivalent of the fireside chat is. Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s took a hold of that newfangled high-tech institution of radio in the 1930s. And what he did with that so marvelously was to persuade Americans to have faith in themselves and in their institutions. And he reached out through radio and he made a personal connection with people. And he said that, and he explained what he was doing. He didn't expect everybody would agree with him necessarily, but he explained what he was trying to do for the American people and made them believe in their institutions. I think that a creative person, it's not me, I'm not the social media person to do this, but a creative person with the right social media could really forge a connection between Americans and their leaders. And it should go both ways. There should be listening as well as explaining.
You know, we're just talking about that in the class tonight, Jared, and I think it ought to be a requirement for every American president to do exactly what Roosevelt did. At 5:30 or 6 on every Friday, you ought to be on television for 15 minutes telling the American people what he or she is going to do and talk about the institutions. I think that would add a lot, because when you don't communicate, there's a lot of misinformation that goes out. At least we'd know what was going on. And Roosevelt was a master of it. And I can still hear him as a young kid starting off with "my friends," and then he'd go on.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think, you know, that charm, that kind of accessibility that Roosevelt had was very appealing and uniting. And I think, you know, Biden and Harris might have some of that too. But I also think part of that transparency, that communication, whatever the medium is, it has to be like, what are our values? Like, what are our founding principles, and how have those been, you know, applied maybe unevenly over time? And what are we going to do about it? Like, find something to unite us all, because I think underneath all of this anger and division, maybe we can unite around some shared principles.
I rather like the ideas that Dwayne, you have just presented, Nikki, you just presented as well. I think that one of the first things that Biden and Harris should do every Friday on television is to remind people of American ideals and values. And it is our commitment to those ideals and values that makes us American, not our belonging to a particular tribe, if you will. Not that we belong to, well, a particular political party. It's not because of our race or ethnicity, but the fact that we subscribe to all those values that makes us Americans and makes us a shining example for the rest of the world.
In this era of alternative facts and alternative reality, that's going to be a huge challenge, because folks are convinced this didn't happen, and if they're told otherwise, they said that's fake news. How do you open those minds?
Yeah, that's tough. Yeah, tough challenge.
That's a $64 question. I thought about that a lot. That's not going to be easy to do, but I think that the communication would help. And I think that one of the things I hope that the Biden-Harris team does, I'd like to have what we did in World War II, or the space program, a war on behalf of science. The best minds working on climate change, the best minds working on solar energy, the best minds working on economics and politics. Put Franklin Roosevelt's brain trust in there. Let them have at it. It can't hurt.
Yeah, it's just really interesting that we keep going back to Roosevelt and Lincoln. And I think the thing that both of them shared, you know, Lincoln was brilliant. Roosevelt, they always say he was like a second-class intellectual, but he surrounded himself with the best and the brightest. And Lincoln also surrounded himself with the best and the brightest, and his rivals, right? So that's just an interesting thing I wanted to point out there.
Interesting point, Nikki, and I think Biden is going to do the same. He, like Roosevelt, may be said to say a second-class intellect, but a first-class attitude.
I've seen a couple things pop up in the chat. I haven't been able to read all of them, but people have suggested that there's a lot that divides right and left in this country. There's a lack of trust. Right-wing media outlets wouldn't, broadcast fireside chats and things like that. And I agree that there's a lot of division, and that it's not good for the nation. And so, in addition to the fireside chats, I would also suggest that Biden and Harris get out to places that they didn't go on the campaign trail and do a lot of listening. So they didn't spend a lot of time in rural places like rural Colorado, but they need to, and they need to know the hurts and the challenges and difficulties that people there live with every day. And I think that one of the first steps for bridging differences is to combine strong leadership and explanation and of what you're doing, and assembling the best and the brightest, but then also combining that with doing a lot of listening.
One of the chats said, what about an old-fashioned press conference? I think that's great. Let the fireside chat be the press conference every Friday. Then all the networks would cover it. And it would be nice, I think, and I thought about this many times in my career, it would be awfully nice, maybe impractical, for the president to be in Washington, D.C. for 3 months out of the year, and then be in Detroit for 3, and then be in San Francisco for 3, and then be in Austin for 3, to get a sense of what the American people believe in, and not just what they believe in the Beltway.
This actually makes me think of, if they can't be there in all of these places for that amount of time, it makes me think of the Kerner Commission, which was commissioned in 1967, where LBJ created a commission to examine race relations. And he sent people out to various heavily African-American cities around the country and spent time just talking to people in barbershops or wherever to get a sense of what the issues are of this inequality, of this kind of emergence of two Americas. And if we had something maybe the same, where like a big listening project, and so because people, generally want to be heard. So I don't know. I saw in the chat also, I shouldn't be distracted by the chat. It's so interesting. But somebody said, are there examples from history to address the current inequality? And I would say something like the Kerner Commission report, but actually listen to it. Take the suggestions.
One of the chats said, how do we get back to World War in an era like World War II where we're all together? Victory gardens and scrap drives and so forth. Well, we were attacked and everybody was all in. But I want to remind you that before World War II broke out with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was bitterly divided between the America Firsters, led by Robert McCormick and Charles Lindbergh and others, about whether or not we wanted to get involved at all. And there was a big controversy there. But when we were attacked, all that ended. And the Japanese made one of the great mistakes of all time because they awakened a sleeping dog.
I think you make a good point there, Dwayne. But I also, World War II, maybe on the surface, people, white people were united, but Japanese Americans were interned. There was still Jim Crow affecting both African Americans and Latinos, right? So there's still these deep inequalities. That we would need to address. So.
There was also minority protest in World War II and World War I, for that matter, that's kind of erased. You don't come across this in the history book, but there always was an opposition and some criticism of militaristic situations and solutions.
Yeah, one of the chats said that we're at war against the virus, and that's a great point. However, only in this country could that become political. You think we'd all be in.
Yeah.
And do the things that we needed to eliminate the virus, but, you know, it's become kind of a political thing.
Well, there you go. There's the question. What will it take to unite us?
Yeah.
Well, I think as much as I hate to do this, we are coming to the end of our time. I see so many excellent questions being raised by a very active audience out there. Questions about have there ever been moments where we've or other examples where we've been able to bridge inequality and slavery? What about young people and the different modes of communication we all have today? There's not just one media channel that everybody tunes into anymore. You know, are there other examples of isolationism that are comparable to the America First policies we've seen recently? What that leads me to believe is that we should do this again sometime. I appreciate you all taking your time. I know it's busy with the semester starting back up, and I really appreciate each of you making time for this. I hope you'll join us again, and I hope everyone out there will join us again when we can have another one of these conversations with our Colorado State Historians Council.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, folks.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everybody.